Hey guys, what's up? I'm Paper Skies, and today we're going to be breaking down my song Daydream. Let's get into a preview of the drop. Hope you guys enjoy that preview. Some quick background on the song. This is my first time doing vocals on a track. It's inspired off of my song Celestial, so if you haven't heard that, feel free to go check it out. But without any further ado, let's move right into the intro. So starting off, we have this sort of like pad sound that's being used in the intro, all the breakdowns, and the outro. Here's what it sounds like. So what this sound is actually just a basic saw and harmor that I'm using, and modulating with a bandpass. And what that bandpass is doing is just cutting the high frequencies and the low frequencies and keeping the mids and swaying around them, and it creates this cool sort of washing feeling with this automation clip here. Then once you add other parts like the LFO and crystallizer, you get something like this. And then finally, our reverb effects are turning this into almost kind of like a pad instead of this like solid in-your-face sound. The main melody in the intro here is actually the same melody that's being played in Celestial as kind of like a nod to it. This is the bells down here. Then utilizing more crystallizer effects, we're able to get some nice stereo textures. The drum line in itself sounds like this. And to give this snare some more tonality and make it fit with the key of the song, I actually created this little tonal pluck in harmor just using a sine wave with a quick volume automation and some reverb. So alone it sounds like this. And then when you add it with all the drum layers, it just gives it kind of like a tonal hit in the low mids. This piano melody is used to fill the gaps when the melody isn't playing and just make it sound like there's still some top notes that are being used. And then we have our respace with a bunch of like cool little stereo natural textures. If you're a little earlier in your production, more or less starting out, and you want to know how to make a res like this, it's actually just a unison 9 saw with a low pass and then some distortion after, and I'm doing some post-processing just on the stereo imaging to make it feel a little bit wider and some saturation to thicken it up. That about wraps things up for the intro. Let's move into the first verse. In the first verse here, I'm using the same pad that I showed off earlier, except it's getting this like low pass that kind of rises up, and I had it sweep down really quickly, along with some other effects, so it almost sounds like the whole track is like dipping underwater and introducing a whole bunch of new elements now that you're down there. And you can hear those elements slowly start to like low pass back in. The original vocal chops from Celestial are actually being used in the verse here, and they don't fully un-low pass until the later portion of the song, but I thought it'd be cool to kind of like tease them in earlier before we get to the outro. When everything gets low passed, I've introduced this like bassy pluck and these atmospheres, which also slowly rise up over time, but create a nice like stereo ambience. So these atmospheres are actually just taken by getting little granule bits of the song here and there in random sections, adding tons of reverb and washing them out, and then MIDI sequencing them so I can kind of play them in a pattern on random. Then using Glitch 2, finally, to just add some cool like glitchy effects and make them sound more clicky. And then after, get that cool like go, 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 go. Moving on from the first part of the verse, we move into this more like 4 on the floor section. Starting off with our drum and Foley layers, this is what I have here. This little part here is me just doing some granular work on the bell, resampling it, and then just throwing it in every here and there with some volume automation, so I got tons of little random takes. This pad that fills up like the wide stereo space is me resampling the song and tons of random bits of it, creating a new melody out of it, and then putting a bandpass filter on it and moving it around to get this cool washing pad effect. Before effects, here's what we got. Kind of cool on its own. Breaking down the effects more or less one at a time, we're starting off with a convolver, which is giving us the melodicness aspect to it. And then a crystallizer and a bunch of reverb effects to wash it out. And our bandpass that's doing all of that movement work. And finally, just a patcher, which is helping out with the dynamics and the stereo imaging, and some other quick cleanup post-process stuff. I find when you include a lot of these sort of layers in your song that just sit very briefly in the stereo but have their own range, it kind of just helps the track feel a lot more immersive and in-depth. Now we have these big plucks here which are playing. The first one is our synth layer, and then bass layers. Now to make the transient on these basses feel soft but still very present in the mix, I'm using a disperser to kind of flatten them out and make them sound a bit more bubbly, along with some phaser movement within the actual sound that's just giving it this like wowie effect, so it's not so straightforward synth. Then moving into the build-up, which won't have its own sections since it is just a lot of repeating elements, I've got these cool little glitch sounds that I've just panned and placed around nicely. And then done a lot of stereo imaging work on them. That completes the verse and build-up essentially. Let's get right into the next part, which is the drop. Moving from top to bottom, I'll start with the drum layers on this. One more unorthodox method that I guess I'm using that I don't know if I really should recommend is getting two separate kind of kicks that I'm layering together that are hitting the same tonality. One that acts more as the transient and one that acts more as the body, since this kick on its own didn't feel like it was kind of thick enough, but I did like the transient hit on it. As I think I've mentioned in some previous videos, I do want to do a proper chord stack breakdown. It's something that I have in the works with some friends, and I'm really excited to get that out. But for now, I won't be breaking down these saws completely, but there's one layer in particular that I do want to play through. What that actually is just an arpeggiator playing really fast on the chords with some bit crush effects, some phaser effects, and just tons of random LFO movements that I'm doing in plugin and post-process. Here's before the processing, and then after. In order to get this arpeggiator, since you can clearly see I'm not actually arpeggiating the whole thing, there's a cool thing that FL users have where if you hit this little cog icon on a lot of plugins really that are MIDI based, you can go to the gear here and see this little arpeggiator section. And what this is doing is it's taking all of these notes and just arpeggiating between them, and then using this time, which is kind of like the rate of arpeggiation, to determine how fast you want to go. So just playing a C major chord, this is what it sounds like. And then this little range button here lets you determine how much higher you want it to go from, or lower, I guess, from the set of notes that you're working with. So in this case, I want it to be able to go at least like an octave higher than what I originally wrote down. So I have it set on 2, but if I set it on 3, then it'll do even more. Now we can move to some of the basses and synths that are being used in the later parts of the drop, starting off with the synth one. This is actually a few layers that are being used here. The first one is a harmor. The second one is some contact pads. And then the third one is just a simple serum. And a lot of the sound is being made in the post-processing. If I turn off the processing chain, here's what we have. The serum is playing just like our chords essentially. Then we have the pads, which are just adding some cool like melodic tonality stuff. And then our harmor, which is this nice like phasery wet sound. The patch itself is a lot of disperser, vocoding, this quick patcher just for like cleanup, serum effects with some phaser movements that I'm automating over time, more disperser, more patcher, just clean up because I want to be able to fit everything in one mixer track. And from there, moving into a sidechain / glitch bus, which is being used for the second half of the drop. Under these layers, I have this kind of bass playing, which was the original idea for the drop before I added this synth over top. This is a pretty simple bass I just made in Serum. Feel free to look over that, but a lot of the movement and the vowelliness is just coming from this phaser here, and then this PP12. I've got some little like bleep bloop square hits just hitting in between. And a really dry basic FL Keys piano because I thought it sounded kind of silly and sort of fun. In the later half, this piano is actually going through the same processing chain as that whole color bass synth that I just showed off, so it sounds a lot cooler and more like this. That phasery ARP that I showed off in the chords is being used in the second half here as kind of like a big layer for the basses that are being hit and introduced. And then underneath there is a bunch of resampling that I did just across the tune and included later on. To get a bit of a better understanding of what I mean by resampling, here is one of the little patches that I kind of made. How these are made is just sitting in the DAW in a separate project usually, or sometimes even in the same one, taking bits of your song that you like and then just throwing tons of random effects and just going for hours until you get like a whole strand of cool results. And then from that long, like 30 minutes of recording that you have with all these different results, you can kind of cut down your favorite bits and introduce them into the track, which is what I did here. Those squares that I mentioned from earlier are also going absolutely nuts in the second half here. Then taking the sound that we already showed off here and putting a glitch 2 on it creates this effect. Using the same bass from earlier, I created this little growl, and then in a resampling project, made this one, which is literally the exact same bass, just through a whole lot more processing. Sweet, so we're in the final verse now. The idea for this section was kind of just to take the verse that I had, and instead of focusing on the vocals, see if I can use it more as an atmosphere. I like the 4 on the floor idea that I had earlier going on, so I kind of kept it and just wanted to take it to a whole different level. Starting off with our drum layers. We see the reintroduction of a lot of things from the verse, like the pad that we mentioned, the bass from earlier, the vocal chops, but the main difference now being the resampling session. If I recall back to this resampling session in particular, I think what I did was I took the vocals, drowned them out in a lot more reverb than before, added a whole bunch of phasers and such on top of that reverb, and then more reverb on top of the phasers, and then did a whole bunch of cleanup and panning, along with the bandpass, the same technique that I showed earlier to make this sound, which is also being reintroduced. Now moving into the second drop, I think one thing I haven't touched on too much is all the automation in the song and the fact that a lot of the empty spaces are getting filled up by huge reverb sweeps and crystallizers and things like that. Making sure that the song is filled up in stereo space even when nothing is going on, I think is still really important, and that can definitely be seen here in this drop. Playing just the bass patches and synths alone in the drop, this is what we have. I'm essentially just using all the elements from the first drop and repurposing them with a new flow to try and get something different for the second one. This sound here, the same arps, and some stuff that I repurposed from a whale sample pack to get these cool tonal hits at the beginning of every bar. The bells are back again, but now they're playing a slightly higher octave with the original Celestial melody again. And in terms of sound design, most things have been covered. It's just a whole lot of reorganization and a lot of careful automation to make sure that the reverbs that I'm creating for a lot of these elements aren't clashing into each other and are fading when they need to. In the second half of the second drop, the Paper Skies lead makes a return. This lead has been more or less discussed in a separate video that I have. There's a lead tutorial video up on my YouTube channel that you can definitely check out, so I won't be going too in-depth on this one, but I've brought in a few new elements like this glitch automation, this scream automation, and a few other macros. And with that out of the way, we have kind of like a repeat of the first drop's B half later on and the B half of this one, and then we can move to the outro. Now, the outro is probably one of my favorite parts of the song. It's sort of the same idea where I'm just taking a lot of elements that we've already used and repurposing them with a new flow. In this case, it's something a little bit bouncier, I feel. I've created this cool pad using some of the granular sessions that I had from earlier I was talking about with the MIDI. Now, what's letting me make these pads almost sound like they're changing notes, even though they're not, is that at the very start of the chain, I have a format shifter, and that's just changing sort of what sounds like the notes, but is really just the format. I love how it like glides between all the notes. Here we've got yet another resampling session being used. The pluck's being used from earlier with some new growls thrown in between. Another growl in Serum that is just using a lot of phaser movement and then some LFO in the post-processing. Taking the massive resampling session that I had earlier, I'm chopping up tons of little bits of it and just organizing it throughout this whole outro part with different panning. Now finally, as I promised when we were talking about the verse, the vocal chops are no longer low passed and have some effects on them finally. Then lastly, before I forget, let's just touch on the drum layers real quick. To end things off, we got this nice little vocal chop resampling session where I just kind of pitch down the vocal and slow down the time of it using a granulizer. And that's it. If you enjoyed this, please make sure to drop a like, subscribe to the channel, all the things that I'm not used to saying because I'm new to this whole YouTube stuff, but I appreciate all the support on these videos. They've been a huge help to just meeting some new people, getting more involved with the community, and having artists I wouldn't expect reach out to me. So thank you very much for all the love. I really hope you all enjoy Daydream. Feel free to take a listen to it on SoundCloud and check out the description where I have the meaning and the lyrics and everything entailed in one package. But besides that, I'm signing off. Thanks for watching.